The signal reached RAF Marham shortly after midnight on April 30th, 1982. Blackbuck 1 was airborne from Wide Awake Airfield on Ascension Island, and the refueling plan was already collapsing. Squadron leader Martin Withers, 28 years old, was flying Vulcan XM607 south into the Atlantic with 21,000-pound bombs in the bay, aimed at the runway at Port Stanley. Behind him, 11 Handley Page Victor K.2 tankers of 55 and 57 squadrons climbed in a choreographed cascade, each one trading fuel before peeling away. The arithmetic had been worked out at High Wycombe by Air Vice Marshal Sir Michael Beetham's staff, who realised within hours of the Argentine invasion on April 2nd that no operational plan existed for striking the Falklands from Ascension. The distance was 3,889 nautical miles round trip. The Vulcan's unrefueled range was roughly 2,600. The Victor, retired from the bomber role a decade earlier and converted to tanking, had never been asked to do anything like this. The Vulcan force itself was 3 weeks from disbandment. Crews at Waddington had been packing memorabilia. Flight Lieutenant Dick Russell, a Victor pilot drafted aboard XM607 as a refueling specialist because most Vulcan crews had not practiced air-to-air refueling in years, sat in the jump seat watching the fuel gauges. The probe leaked. The seal on the Vulcan's refueling nozzle, last used in earnest during the early 1960s, had perished in storage. Fuel sprayed across the windscreen on the first contact, freezing into opaque slush that Withers cleared with the wipers while still taking on JP4 from the Victor ahead. The plan called for the final Victor, callsign Red 2, to pass fuel to a penultimate tanker, which would then pass fuel to Withers for the run-in to Stanley. Red 2 was captained by squadron leader Bob Tuxford of 55 Squadron, a 36-year-old who had been at Marham since the Vulcan Victor force had stood as Bomber Command's nuclear deterrent in the early 1960s. Somewhere south of 25 degrees south in heavy weather, the receiving Victor's own refueling probe broke on contact. Fuel sheared off into the night. Tuxford, who was meant to hand over and turn back, now held the only viable transfer slot left on the southbound chain. He had a decision to make in under a minute. The fuel he was carrying was Ascension's, calculated for his return leg. If he transferred it onward to keep the Vulcan moving, he would not have enough to reach Ascension himself. There was no diversion airfield. The South Atlantic between Ascension and Rio de Janeiro held nothing but water. Brazilian airspace was politically closed to a British military aircraft conducting a combat sortie. Landing there meant internment of crew and impoundment of airframe, a diplomatic mess the Foreign Office had explicitly warned Northwood to avoid. Tuxford did not consult Ascension. The HF radio link to the operations cell had been deliberately kept silent for emissions security. Breaking it now would alert any Soviet intelligence trawler in the area to the operation's existence. He pressed forward, transferred the fuel, and turned north, knowing he would have to fly the return at higher altitude on a fuel margin so thin that his navigator, Flight Lieutenant Ernie Wallace, began calculating ditching coordinates. Withers, meanwhile, pressed on towards Stanley, unaware that the man behind him had just gambled a Victor, 4 crew, and a place in the chain of command on a calculation he had performed in his head. What happened on Tuxford's return leg is what NATO pilots, briefed weeks later, refused to believe. The Victor K.2 was a converted strategic bomber, not a purpose-built tanker. Handley Page had delivered the first B.2 variants to Wittering in 1962 as part of the V-Force, carrying Yellow Sun and later Blue Steel standoff weapons against Soviet targets. By 1965, the Royal Air Force had given up the high-altitude penetration mission as obsolete. And by 1975, the surviving airframes had been stripped of bombing equipment at Hawker Siddeley's Woodford plant and fitted with 3 Hosen-Drogue refueling units, 1 centerline, 2 on underwing pods. The Mark 17B drogue system was reliable in the configuration Bomber Command had imagined for it, namely passing fuel to Lightnings and Phantoms over the North Sea. It had never been used for a cascade of this depth. The fuel arithmetic for Black Buck 1 was worked out by a small team at Strike Command headquarters under Group Captain Jeremy Price. Their problem was straightforward in form and brutal in detail. A Victor K.2 carried roughly 91,000 pounds of fuel internally and could pass perhaps 45,000 pounds without compromising its own recovery. To put a Vulcan with a full bomb load over Stanley, refuel it on the way down and refuel it again on the way back required 11 tankers in the outbound chain and a further 4 for the recovery. 2 reserve Victors stood by at Wide Awake. The chain depended on each transfer happening within a tight altitude band, and at a speed the Vulcan could sustain with bomb bay doors closed and external tanks bleeding correctly. Wide Awake itself was the constraint. The airfield, leased to the United States under a 1962 agreement and operated by Pan American on a contract basis, had a single runway and minimal parking. The American base commander, Captain Bob McLeod of the U.S. Navy, was instructed by Washington on April 7th to provide full logistic support, short of direct combat participation. Within a fortnight, the apron held more aircraft than at any point in its history. Victors of 55 and 57 squadrons, 2 Vulcans from 44 and 50 squadrons, Nimrod MR-2S from Kinloss, Hercules transports, and the occasional VC-10. Pilots queued for fuel like cars at a petrol station. The ground crew worked in equatorial heat with no hangars. Bantam, by then Chief of the Air Staff, had pushed the operation against skepticism from the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, who regarded it as a Royal Air Force vanity project that would divert resources from the carrier-borne Sea Harriers already engaged. The argument was settled in a meeting at Northwood on April 16th. Bantam, who had flown Lancasters over Germany in 1944 and Victor tankers in the 1960s, told the assembled chiefs that the symbolic value of striking Stanley from 8,000 miles away was worth the operational cost. Margaret Thatcher, briefed the following day at Chequers, agreed. The Foreign Secretary, Francis Pym, was less enthusiastic. The Joint Intelligence Committee had assessed that Argentine air defences at Stanley were thin, and a single Vulcan strike was unlikely to disable the runway sufficiently to prevent fast jet operations. The mission went anyway for reasons that were political as much as military. If the Vulcan could reach Stanley, so theoretically could anything else the Royal Air Force flew. The strategic message was directed not at Buenos Aires but at Moscow, and beyond Moscow at the alliance that watched Britain's expeditionary capability with quiet interest. Tuxford's calculation in the early hours of May 1st would determine whether that message arrived. The return leg began at 19,000 feet with Red 2's fuel reading lower than any Victor captain at Marham had ever seen in operational use. Tuxford climbed to flight level 430 to reduce specific fuel consumption, throttled back the 4 Rolls-Royce Conway engines to long-range cruise, and instructed his co-pilot, Flight Lieutenant Glenn Rees, to compute the recovery in 3 independent ways, and present him with the most pessimistic. The answer came back the same in each case. Red 2 would arrive over Ascension dry or short. The crew began jettisoning anything not bolted in: sextant cases, ration boxes, the chemical toilet's contents. The navigator, Ernie Wallace, used the Decca Doppler to refine their position against the planned track. The radio operator, Flight Lieutenant Mick Beer, monitored Ascension's TACAN beacon, waiting for the first flicker of acquisition. Tuxford ordered emissions control broken at 1 hour out and called Ascension for a tanker launch to meet him short of the field. The watch officer at Wide Awake, who had been told nothing of the in-flight fuel transfer that had occurred south of the equator, queried the request twice before scrambling Victor XL 189 on 5 minutes' notice. What happened in the next 90 minutes is what the NATO liaison officers later struggled to reconcile with their understanding of Victor tanker operations. Tuxford's aircraft was not configured to receive fuel. Victor K.2s carried a refueling probe forward of the cockpit, but the operational doctrine at Marham assumed tankers gave fuel, and did not take it. The probes were rarely serviced for receiving operations. The hoses were not regularly tested for compatibility between airframes of the same fleet, refueling each other in flight, because nobody had imagined the requirement. American KC-135 squadrons exchanged fuel between tankers as a routine training exercise. The Royal Air Force did not. XL-189, captained by squadron leader Barry Neal, climbed to meet Red 2 roughly 400 nautical miles south of Ascension at first light on May 1st. The two Victors closed at a relative speed Tuxford afterwards described as uncomfortably high. The transfer required Red 2 to slot in behind XL-189 and accept fuel through a probe last pressure tested some months earlier at Marham. It worked on the second contact. Tuxford took on enough JP4 to reach Ascension with a margin measured in single-digit minutes of fuel. He landed at Wideawake at 06:48 local time. Withers' Vulcan XM607 had landed 40 minutes earlier, having been refueled on its own recovery leg by a separate Victor sortie. The crews met on the apron. Withers handed Tuxford a bottle of whiskey from the Vulcan's flight bag, which was the customary acknowledgement at Marham of a tanker captain who had given more than the briefing required. The mission was assessed in London the same morning. Of the 21 bombs released, one had cratered the runway at Stanley. The Argentine Air Force could no longer base fast jets there, which was the operational outcome the Joint Planning Staff had requested. The strategic outcome was something else. Within 48 hours, Soviet signals intelligence stations at Lords in Cuba and at Cam Ranh Bay had logged the operation. Within a week, intelligence summaries circulating in the Pentagon noted that Britain had demonstrated a long-range strike capability the Royal Air Force had not, on paper, possessed since the early 1960s. The question NATO planners began to ask was how the refueling chain had actually worked, because the published British doctrine did not describe what Tuxford had done. The answer lay partly in training that had not appeared in any NATO exercise program. Marham's tanker force, under Group Captain John Laycock, had practiced cascading transfers throughout the late 1970s as part of the contingency planning for reinforcing the British Army of the Rhine in a Warsaw Pact scenario. The doctrine was classified at Secret UK Eyes Alpha and held within Strike Command. The American Strategic Air Command, which operated tankers in larger numbers but in shorter chains supporting B-52 routes from Diego Garcia, Guam, and the continental United States, had no equivalent procedure. SAC's tankers refueled bombers in pairs or threes. They did not pass fuel forward through 11 aircraft to extend a single sortie by 3,800 miles. The procedural difference came down to crew authority. A Royal Air Force Victor captain could decide, in flight and without reference to a controlling authority, to transfer fuel beyond his briefed allocation. A Strategic Air Command tanker captain, operating under the single integrated operational plan, could not. The American system was designed for nuclear release authority and required positive control of every fuel transfer above a specified threshold. The British system, born of smaller numbers and a culture inherited from Bomber Command, devolved the decision to the man with his hand on the throttle. This was the point that NATO pilots briefed at High Wycombe in June 1982 found hard to accept. The briefing given by Wing Commander Colin Seymour walked through the Black Buck refueling diagram in detail. American officers asked repeatedly who had authorized Tuxford to break the fuel allocation and continue south. Seymour's answer, which appears in the declassified briefing notes at the National Archives, was that Tuxford had authorized himself. The Americans found this culturally implausible. A Belgian liaison officer, Colonel Jan Verbeeker, asked what would have happened if Tuxford had ditched. Seymour said the crew would have been listed as missing in action, and the operation would have continued with the reserve victors. The cultural gap was the point. The Royal Air Force in 1982 still operated under the assumption that individual aircrew judgment, exercised within a framework of mission orders rather than detailed control, would produce better outcomes than centralized authority. This was a doctrinal inheritance from the Second World War, sharpened during the Vi-Force years when Bomber Command pilots had stood quick reaction alert at airfields, including Coningsby, Scampton and Waddington, with nuclear weapons under their wings and authority to release them on receipt of a coded signal. The men who flew Black Buck had trained under that system. Tuxford himself had stood QRA at Marham as a young Victor pilot in the late 1960s. The Americans had moved away from that model after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The single integrated operational plan, refined through the 1960s and 1970s, removed individual discretion from nuclear operations and, by extension, from the conventional missions that supported them. The British, with smaller forces and a different theology of nuclear command, had retained the older model. Black Buck was its operational vindication. The Soviet intelligence assessment, recovered after 1991 from GRU archives partially open to Western researchers, reached a similar conclusion. A report dated May 12, 1982, signed by Colonel General Pyotr Ivashutin's deputy, noted that the Royal Air Force had executed an operation of greater operational complexity than the corresponding American capability would have permitted under SAC procedures. The report was distributed to the Soviet General Staff and, according to Christopher Andrews' later research, to the KGB residency in London. What Moscow drew from it was not what Washington drew. Moscow drew the conclusion that British conventional forces, despite a decade of public defence cuts under successive governments, retained operational flexibility that the Warsaw Pact air planning model could not easily counter. The implication, set out in a Soviet General Staff paper dated July 1982 and partially summarised in the Mitrokhin archive material delivered to MI6 in 1992, was that British tanker forces could potentially extend the range of NATO strike aircraft into Soviet territory from bases the Pact had assumed were too distant to be relevant. The paper named Marham, Bruggen and Akrotiri specifically. Washington drew something narrower. The United States Air Force Study Group, convened at Langley under Lieutenant General Charles Gabriel, concluded that the Royal Air Force had achieved the Vulcan strike at the cost of a tanker fleet utilization rate that no American command would have authorized. 12 Victors flown to support one bomber on one mission was, in SAC terms, an inefficient use of strategic assets. The American assessment missed the British point, which was that the Royal Air Force had no other way of striking Stanley and had therefore designed an operation around the constraint. The Gabriel report, declassified in 2007, treated this as a curiosity rather than a lesson. The lesson was absorbed within the British system. Air Vice Marshal Beetham, by then Chief of the Air Staff, used Black Buck in evidence to the House of Commons Defence Committee in November 1982 to argue against further cuts to the Victor fleet. He won that argument. The Victors remained in service until 1993, retiring only when the VC-10K.3 and TriStar K.1 conversions had reached operational maturity. The Vulcans were not so fortunate. XM-607 and her sister aircraft were withdrawn from service in December 1982, having been kept on for one final tour beyond their planned retirement, specifically to complete the 5 Black Buck missions flown between May 1st and June 12th. The men involved received the recognition customary in British service for operations conducted in the public eye. Withers was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, gazetted on October 8, 1982. Tuxford received the Air Force Cross, gazetted the same day. The citations, written at Strike Command and signed off by Beetham, mentioned neither the broken probe nor the fuel transfer south of the equator. The Royal Air Force preferred, then as now, to describe operational improvisation in the language of routine execution. The Argentine surrender at Port Stanley on June 14, 1982, ended the immediate operational requirement. The strategic conversation continued. In the years following, NATO tanker doctrine evolved to incorporate cascading transfer procedures, borrowed, with attribution, from the Royal Air Force. The American KC-10 extender fleet, entering service from 1981, was eventually configured to operate in chains of 3 or 4 aircraft, which was the closest SAC came to the Marham model. The full 11-tanker cascade was never replicated in NATO practice. It had been in part a function of the Victor's specific fuel capacity and the Vulcan's specific demand, and in part a function of a command culture that no longer existed. The Soviet conclusion proved more consequential than the American one. Through the mid-1980s, Warsaw Pact planning for a conflict in the central region assumed that British conventional air power could project further than its declared order of battle suggested. This affected the dispositions of Pact air defence forces in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, drawing radar coverage westward and creating gaps that GCHQ, working with the Defence Intelligence Staff at Whitehall, mapped through the late 1980s. Blackbuck's significance was not the cratered runway at Stanley. Its significance was what GCHQ at Cheltenham picked up from Warsaw Pact signals traffic in the weeks following May 1, 1982. The traffic showed Soviet air defense headquarters at Legnica in Poland and at Wunstorf-Zossen, south of Berlin, requesting clarification from Moscow on the implications of British long-range tanker operations for the existing air defense plan covering the group of Soviet forces Germany. The requests were routine in form and significant in substance. They indicated that the Soviet General Staff had not previously regarded the Royal Air Force's strategic reach as a planning factor in the European theatre. The Joint Intelligence Committee's assessment, circulated to Cabinet on June 10, 1982 under the chairmanship of Sir Anthony Ackland of the Foreign Office, drew the connection explicitly. The paper, marked Top Secret Umbra and now held at Kew under reference CAB 186, concluded that Black Buck had altered the Soviet appreciation of British capability in a manner disproportionate to the operation's tactical effects. The assessment was not entirely welcomed in Whitehall. The Treasury under Sir Douglas Wass regarded any argument that strengthened the case for retaining expensive aircraft fleets with predictable scepticism. The Cabinet Office under Sir Robert Armstrong took a more elliptical view. What was not in doubt was the operational data. Tuxford's fuel transfer performed in darkness somewhere between 25 and 30 degrees south on the morning of May 1st, became the procedural reference point for subsequent Black Buck missions. The second mission, Black Buck 2, flown by Squadron Leader John Reeve on the night of May 3rd, used the same refueling cascade with minor modifications, informed by the first mission's experience. Reeve's bombs missed the runway. Black Buck 3 was cancelled due to weather. Black Buck 4 and 5 flown on 28th and 31st May against Argentine radar installations using Shrike anti-radiation missiles supplied by the United States, employed a reduced cascade of 7 Victors. Black Buck 6, flown on June 3rd by Squadron Leader Neil McDougall, used 5 tankers and ended with the Vulcan, diverting to Rio de Janeiro after its refueling probe broke on the return leg, requiring the Foreign Office to extract aircraft and crew through delicate negotiations with the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. The Rio diversion, which was precisely the diplomatic mess the Foreign Office had warned against at the outset, was managed by the British ambassador in Brasilia, Sir George Hall, with a combination of legal argument and personal courtesy that secured the aircraft's release within 8 days. McDougall's crew were treated as distressed mariners under maritime convention, applied by analogy, a legal fiction that satisfied the Brazilians and allowed the Royal Air Force to recover the Vulcan with minimum public attention. Black Buck 7, the final mission, was flown by Withers again on June 12th, 2 days before the Argentine surrender. By then, the operations had become procedurally routine within Strike Command, although the strategic value of each successive mission diminished as the ground campaign on East Falkland approached its conclusion. The cumulative effect was the point. 7 missions flown from Ascension, employing in total over 50 Victor tanker sorties, had demonstrated to anyone watching that the Royal Air Force could put a heavy bomber over a target 8,000 miles from base and recover it. The fact that the bomber was a 1950s design kept on past its retirement date, and the tankers were 1960s designs converted from a previous role, did not change the operational fact. Moscow's planning shifted accordingly. So, more quietly did Washington's appreciation of British conventional capability. The American appreciation matured slowly. The Reagan administration, which had supported the Falklands operation through intelligence sharing, arranged by Caspar Weinberger, and the supply of AIM-9L Sidewinders, AGM-45 Shrikes and fuel at Ascension, regarded Britain afterwards as a more capable ally than the pre-1982 assessments had allowed for. This was reflected in the Trident II procurement agreement, signed at Camp David in March 1982 in its initial form and finalized later, which committed Britain to the next generation of submarine-launched nuclear missiles on terms favorable to the Royal Navy. The Black Buck operations were one element in a broader recalibration. The Falklands Campaign as a whole demonstrated to Washington that British military capability, while smaller than the United States in every dimension, retained the doctrinal flexibility and operational autonomy to conduct complex expeditionary operations without American operational involvement. Weinberger told a National Security Council meeting on May 21, 1982, according to minutes released in 2009, that the British had executed an amphibious operation at 8,000 miles range on capability we did not think they had retained. The Royal Air Force used this assessment to argue for retaining capabilities that the 1981 Knott Review had marked for reduction. John Knott, who as Defence Secretary had proposed cuts to the Royal Navy that the Falklands subsequently reversed, was less willing to revisit the Air Force settlement. The Tornado GR-1 force, which entered service from 1982, absorbed much of the strike role that the Vulcans had performed. The Victor tankers continued, supplemented from 1984 by VC-10K.2 and K.3 conversions based at Bryce Norton, until the slow drawdown of the late 1980s. The cultural memory of Black Buck within the Royal Air Force settled into a particular form. The official narrative set out in the post-operation report compiled at Strike Command in late 1982 emphasized the planning achievement and the disciplined execution of a complex refueling plan. The unofficial narrative preserved in squadron mess histories at Marham and Waddington emphasized the individual decisions: Tuxford's fuel transfer, Wither's acceptance of a leaking probe, McDougall's diversion to Rio. The two narratives were not in conflict. They described different aspects of the same operation. What neither narrative emphasized, because the Royal Air Force tradition discouraged it, was the strategic effect. Beetham, in his evidence to the Defence Committee, used the operation to argue for capability retention, but did not draw the broader conclusion that GCHQ had drawn from the Warsaw Pact signals traffic. The conclusion was held within the intelligence community and shared with American counterparts at NSA, but not made public. The Cold War context required discretion about what British signals intelligence could and could not read in real time, and which Soviet command decisions had been influenced by which British actions. By 1985, with Mikhail Gorbachev's accession to the General Secretaryship and the beginning of the strategic shift that would lead to the INF Treaty in 1987, and the unilateral Soviet reductions of 1988, the Black Buck assessments had been overtaken by larger events. The Royal Air Force's demonstration of long-range strike was absorbed into the general Soviet appreciation of NATO capability, which by the late 1980s was increasingly being recalibrated downwards as the Pact's own crisis deepened. The victors were retired in 1993, 2 years after the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The last operational sortie was flown from Marham by XH-672, captained by Wing Commander David Williams, on November 30th of that year. The aircraft is preserved at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford. Tuxford retired from the Royal Air Force as a squadron leader. He spoke publicly about the mission for the first time at a Marham reunion in 2002, by which point the relevant files had begun to be released to the National Archives at Kew. His account, given in front of an audience that included Withers and most of the surviving Black Buck crews, matched the documentary record in its essentials. Where it differed was in tone. The official files described a fuel transfer. Tuxford described a decision taken in the absence of authority to take it, in the knowledge that no one above his rank would have approved it if asked, and in the certainty that the operation would fail if he did not take it. This was the answer the NATO pilots at High Wycombe had been looking for in June 1982. The procedural explanation which Wing Commander Seymour had given them in good faith was incomplete. The full answer required acknowledging a command culture that the Royal Air Force preferred not to advertise, one in which mission accomplishment, defined narrowly and pursued without reference to higher authority, once the aircraft had taken off, was the implicit standard. The Victor Force at Marham operated under that standard. So did the V-Force generally throughout the Cold War. So did the submarine commanders of the Polaris fleet at Faslane, who carried in their safes a letter of last resort from the Prime Minister of the day and the authority to act upon it without further instruction. The British nuclear command and control system, refined through the 1960s and 1970s under Harold Macmillan, Harold Wilson, Edward Heath, James Callaghan, and Margaret Thatcher, rested ultimately on the same proposition. Once the aircraft or submarine was committed, the captain would do what the captain judged necessary. The strategic implication of Black Buck was that this proposition extended into conventional operations and produced outcomes the American system could not have produced. Whether those outcomes were always desirable was a separate question, and one that the Royal Air Force tradition did not invite outsiders to examine. The Vulcan XM607 was preserved at Royal Air Force Waddington. Withers retired as a wing commander and spoke about the mission at lectures and to historians, including in the substantial oral history project conducted by the Imperial War Museum during the 1990s. The Victor refueling chain became a case study at the Royal Air Force Staff College at Bracknell, taught not as a model to be emulated, but as an example of what a particular command culture could achieve under operational pressure. The Cold War ended 4 years after MacDougall diverted to Rio. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, and with it the planning assumptions on which the Warsaw Pact had operated. The Black Buck operations became, in retrospect, one of the last large-scale demonstrations of British strategic air power, conducted under the assumption that the Soviet Union was the principal adversary against whom such capability would ultimately be measured. The audience the operation had been designed to reach in Moscow as much as Buenos Aires ceased to exist as a coherent strategic actor within a decade. The capability persisted. The Royal Air Force retained air-to-air refueling as a core competence through the 1990s and into the operations over Iraq and the former Yugoslavia, where the procedures developed at Marham for Black Buck were used again, with modifications to support operations at ranges the planners of 1982 would have recognised. Tuxford lives in Suffolk. The whiskey bottle Withers gave him on the apron at Wide Awake on May 1st, 1982 sits, according to a 2007 interview with the Imperial War Museum, unopened on a shelf in his study.